always, and helping everything run smoothly and happen is Leila Taragi, a program coordinator with ACC Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, and Dr. Mark Cunningham, our film professor who curates and runs this film series for us. Also joining us are Dr. Maria Cotera, an associate professor in Mexican American and Latino Studies Department at UT, the UT, across the street from us. And she will say a little bit more about herself. And Dr. Gary Moreno, who is director of ACC Center for Latino and Latin American Studies did I say ACC? It's never too many times to say ACC, Austin Community College. And we are delighted to have him with us too. So Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay.
To say a little bit more about yourself and then.
Oh, just briefly, my name is Dr. Mark Cunningham. I am an associate professor in the radio, television, and film department here at ACC. I teach courses in, media studies, film studies, and also teach media literacy courses here at the college. I am currently writing a book for Columbia University Press on John Singleton and about Los Angeles and race, gender, and narrative in his movies, Boys in the Hood, Poetic Justice, and Baby Boy. So as you all know about writing, like this. So I'm doing a lot of reading, a lot of research and stuff too. So I'm happy to be here as usual.
I'll go next.
Yes, Maria. Yes, yeah.
So my name is Maria Cotera. I'm actually a recent transplant to Austin, although I was born here and I did grow up here. I went to graduate school first at UT and then at Stanford University. And then right out of graduate school, it was a different time. I was hired with a postdoc with a guaranteed job after, those days. Those were such good days back in the day. Hired at the University of Michigan and have been there about 18 years. I also directed the Latino Studies program there, which is a sub-program inside of American Culture, which is a department there. And I am absolutely over the moon to be back here in my place of birth and warmer weather. And although 2 weeks ago, I was like, what did I do? What did I bring with me? Yeah, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to make ties with ACC. My mother was a teacher at ACC, professor at ACC for many years. It's a wonderful institution and so honored to be here with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Gary?
Yeah, I'm also a recent transplant here to Austin, coming by way of Oklahoma. I'm originally from California, and I teach Mexican and U.S. history at ACC. I have a forthcoming publication as well with the University of New Mexico Press titled Charro, the History of a Cultural Icon. So I'm a cultural historian and I've worked a lot with film, so I really enjoyed watching this movie for the very first time, and it really kind of allowed me to return to what was originally my first love. I thought I was going to be a film director, but that didn't pan out. I became a historian instead.
Wow.
Welcome to the club there, Gary. But we have to commiserate about that.
Yeah, I just didn't want to end up, filming shoe commercials for the rest of my life.
I got you. Oh man, that's pretty good.
Oh, and by the way, I just want to say that this is water, not wine. I just thought it was important to point that out. It's just the only glass I could find ready to hand. So I don't want anyone to think I'm not being entirely serious and academic and professional here. It is water. I can say.
That's hilarious. That's awesome. Man. Okay, well, Shireen, if you take it from there, and we can start talking about Salt of the Earth. I'm so excited to talk about this film with both Gary and Maria. If you all don't mind saying, as opposed to, we can use formalities if you like, but is Gary and Maria cool?
I'm good.
All right, good deal. And so Again, I guess I'm very excited to talk about this movie. As I mentioned to you all prior to the recording, that I was introduced to this film when I was in film school by the great Charles Ramirez Berg. And I always say the great in front of his name because Charles has taught me so much. And, you know, and just as, you know, just one of the knows more about film than just about anybody I know. And he introduced this film to us in film school, and I've never forgotten it. And so when we got together, you know, Shireen and Layla and I, you know, to put this put this program together, put this film series together, I immediately knew that I wanted to talk about this film and wanted to include this film because I think it's such an important film for a number of reasons. And so just a little bit, you know, just to, for those, I'm sure, hopefully everyone had a chance to watch it. But of course, we know the movie is about, you know, these Mexican-American workers who protest these kind of unsafe working conditions and unequal wages, right, compared to their Anglo counterparts at this zinc mine in New Mexico. But then what is born out of that, right, is the support of the women, their wives, who come to their defense when they find that their protest is being challenged, and they find a loophole for the women to help them. And then it really also kind of turns into this gender battle and this kind of feminist examination of feminism in some ways too, as well as, you know, labor conditions, but also too this discussion about being Mexican or being Mexican American, which I thought was incredibly interesting. And so I'm just so happy to have this conversation with you all. So let's just get started. Let me ask you, you know, the very first question, which is, you know, in looking at this film and kind of thinking about this movie, why is it, you know, why is this film, in Gary and Maria, your opinion, why do you feel this movie would be so important to our understanding of both Mexicans and Mexican Americans historically and currently?
Mm-hmm. I'll let Gary go first. No
Okay.
follow up.
All right, thank you. You know, there's a long history of organized labor within the Mexican American community. You know, you can go back to the UFW, the United Farm Workers, talk about Cesar Chavez, but it's very long, you know, and that's what struck me about the movie when I started watching it. Maybe it's because I had just been lecturing about the Mexican Revolution, but I mean, really, you can take some of these issues that are raised all the way back to that moment in time. You know, the Cananea copper strike, which was so instrumental to, you know, what eventually became the Mexican Revolution. You know, but you can take it on beyond there. I mean, you can talk about Ludlow, right? The Ludlow massacre, where there was a large percentage of Mexican workers there as well. And then, you know, the pecan sheller strike here in San Antonio as well. That's the image that came to me, and that's where kind of it all fit within my mind. But I mean, I'm a historian, so that's kind of logical that it would go that way. So that's why I think it's important, you know. And, you know, talking about some of the struggles of today, you know, we're at a point where I think these issues are coming up again, you know, in amongst labor. So it's important to revisit it now, I think, for that moment.
Mm-hmm. So I have a unique relationship to this film. And I should say something a little bit about what my current work is. So since 2009, I have been building a very large digital repository documenting Chicana feminism in the 1960s and 70s, largely inspired by my mother and her generation, who my mother just joined us, by the way. So, so that project is called Chicana por mi raza, and it involves, you know, we have a very large repository of oral histories and archival objects, some 10,000 archival objects and nearly 200 oral histories, thousands of hours of oral history. And one of the things that has been so interesting looking at this archive, so let me just backtrack. What I want to say is that the question of the voice of women in this film is really profound and way ahead of its time, because at this time, the Communist Party, right, is having pretty pitched battles, right? So it was made in, I think, 1952. 54. Yeah. So like they're the bracero. So, you know, you have the bracero issue in California and the beginnings of Operation Wetback, right? And so within the CPUSA, there's all these battles that are happening around the question of the women's question and also around race. Right, so especially in California, CP USA groups are debating, right? Particularly Mexican Americans in those groups are debating the attention that the Communist Party is or is not giving to these issues. To me, this is a propaganda film, and likely connected to the CP USA. I don't have a problem with that personally. I don't think, I think at this time, it's a difficult time to make propaganda films. The CPUSA is largely retreating and undercover. Some of the women, not the women we interviewed, but their mentors, in particular, Francisca Flores, who was a leading light in the organizing in San Diego and later LA in the 50s, 40s and 50s and into the 60s. She was involved with the CPUSA, and she had a copy of this film, a reel, like a big old reel.
Yeah, in the can, huh?
Yeah. And in the 1960s, she was almost single-handedly responsible for reviving it. She would do showings in, community bookstores and centers. And, by the late 1960s, Chicanas who are emerging in their feminist consciousness within the Chicano movement are citing Salt of the Earth as an evidence of a long history of women's organizing in these spaces that had exclusively been male spaces for organizing. And so for me, like, the connection to this film is not just in terms of like the incredibly prescient, way it discusses politics in an intersectional way, but also the way it became a keystone or touchstone media object for Chicana feminists who had almost nothing like it. They didn't have anything like it. There were no films about Chicanas. There was, so this is the closest thing they had. And this film also, in its representation of women's issues and how they organize, gave them something to sort of, model on and say, like, this is not what we're doing is not any different than what they did. We have a long history of organizing. So to me, this film has like multiple levels that are historical, both in its making and that moment for the, left and people of color in the left, and also for the 1960s, a later moment in which it is monumentally important.
Well, I mean, you bring up something, Maria, that I think is very interesting. I mean, this is a question I also had. So I want to piggyback on first your statement about this being very much so a propaganda film. And then I want to circle back and ask you and Gary a question about the feminist leanings in the film as well, too. And so, I mean, Gary, a little bit, you were talking about like some of the things in YouTube, Maria, where you were talking about some of the things the film reminded you of. And like, with my knowledge as a Black man and what I know and what I've learned over the years about Mexican and Mexican-American history, just kind of reading Victor Villaseñor's book, Reign of Gold, kind of really reminded me of some of the events that kind of happened. So I really like that book. And I wonder why nobody's made a movie out of that, if I could just throw that in there. But anyway, but it kind of reminded me of those same kind of struggles in terms of labor and kind of relationships between men and women, where I think it becomes very important and kind of stands out and within this history. But just to kind of backtrack a little bit and kind of go back to the notion of propaganda. So Pauline Kael, the celebrated film critic Pauline Kael, said of Salt of the Earth in Sight and Sound magazine in 1954 that this movie, she said, first of all, she said it was kind of a left-leaning film. And of course, knowing Pauline as curmudgeonly, right, as Pauline Kael can be, sometimes, and contentious maybe even in some ways, but still an incredible critic. But she said that the film was as clear a piece of communist propaganda as we have had in many years. So why you gonna hate? Power to the people, right? So why was the film, do you think, seen as pro-communist and even pro-labor by some people? And what stands out to you as particularly threatening about this movie, particularly for the mid-1950s?
Let me, if you don't mind, Maria, can I jump in here?
Of course.
Yeah, so I think, when it comes to this issue, because I also believe with Maria that it's a, communist film or a propaganda film.
Really?
but it's just people, I think, when they make this accusation that we're watching a communist propaganda film, I think people don't know how to distinguish between communism and socialism, and all that gets wrapped up into that. I think that it's really important to be able to distinguish between those two, be able to distinguish between communism, and socialism, and they're different in many regards. But I think one of the most important ones is in electoral politics, right? You can have socialism through electoral politics. You can't have communism through electoral politics, right? You have to have like the whole state single party, and so I think that's important. Now, I don't really think that it's a communist propaganda film. I think that it would be more on the level of a socialist propaganda film. And I don't know if you can slice it that way, but it's important to make that distinction. And I know Pauline Kael made this comment that, it's a communist propaganda film, but we have to question that, I think. And even if we want to divide it even further, we can, right? We can talk about the radical politics along the borderlands around this time, right? You can relate it back to Magonismo, right? To the Magon brothers, who are bringing a lot of these socialist ideas to workers along the border through their publication of, newspapers, Regeneración. There's a couple images in the film in which they show Benito Juarez, right? And this is supposed to, convey to you how Mexican they are, how much pride they have in their Mexican history, perhaps. And I think that was, Benito Juarez is kind of like a stand-in symbol for people's Mexican identity, especially early on in cinema. I think what would have been a more relevant image to put up there for them to revere, and which was probably what most people had in their homes along the border, is an image of the Magon brothers, because they were really important and influential in bringing some of these ideas to the border, to the United States. They basically exported the revolution over the border. And so these ideas, even once the Magon brothers are gone, these ideas stay, and they become then, the basis upon which other people can build socialism and communism if they wish. So that's my thoughts on that.
All right, Maria?
I do think it's a propaganda film, but I agree with Gary that it is not a communist propaganda film. And in fact, I would say that it contests some basic tenets of communism, and particularly communism's exclusive focus on class. What I think that this film is, what distinguishes this film is that in its focus on race, on the equal importance of race and racial identity and gender and issues surrounding gender, and not allowing class, right? It is a critique of the class exclusive sort of framework of communism at let's say emerging from the 1930s, right? So, it's a labor film, but I also think it's a labor film that is very complicated. Because for one thing, it's incredibly sophisticated and nuanced in its analysis, because it's basically saying, the hidden labor of women is exploited labor, as well as every bit as the labor of minors that's obviously being exploited as exploited labor, right? So that, the way in which the film inserts the quote unquote women's question, which was a major issue, and also the race issue, which was a major issue for the Popular Front in the 1940s and 50s. And in fact, is the reason why Mexicans, Blacks, and other folks left the Popular Front, and women left the Popular Front, because of the class exclusive prism. And so for me, this film is very unique in its intersectional presentation of the oppressive force of capitalism and its impact on a community. And the other thing I think is really important about this film is, and touches on what Gary was saying, that in its presentation of the struggles of rural Mexicans, not as exclusively land-based, though that is part of their struggle. Clearly, it's articulated in the film, but as a labor struggle, that is quite unusual, because there's a very romantic vision, right, at this time of Mexicans as an agrarian. Well, it's not romantic, but a capitalist vision of Mexicans as an agrarian labor force exclusively, right? And so this showing that they were actually, you know, a laboring force that's much more akin or has, you know, connections to a white laboring force, miners.
Mm-hmm.
It's presenting a very unusual picture of Mexicans at the time and their, you know, prevailing issues.
Right. I think it's really interesting you bring that up too. That's something that stood out for me too, that it was zinc mines, right? And this, you know, and kind of getting away from this kind of stereotypical idea that it's just like, you know, strawberries and agricultural, you know, but the fact that it moves into this space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like you say, and you see them negotiating with and working with white miners and still making it very clear to them, right, that your struggle is not my struggle. Mm-hmm. Right. I love the scene where they were talking about, yeah, if I asked him who this was on the wall, he wouldn't be able to tell me, but I know everything, you know, that he has to, you know, about his side and whatever else. And I think that's, for people of color, that is something that, you know, Black people, people of color, all of us, that's something we certainly can point to and say, you know, you don't need to know anything about us to be considered well-read, well-versed, anything, but we, in fact, have to know our stuff and your stuff in order to get you know, anything done, so to speak, right? If anything done, right? So Sharina asked the question here that I think is also to kind of piggyback on what you were saying about capitalism, Maria, where she says, so by this standard, we say, right, that many films are military war propaganda and almost all films are capitalist propaganda.
Yes. I mean, all films are propaganda. It's not, you know, it's just what side they're, you know, propagandizing. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, agreed. I thought the same thing, Shreen.
You know, good deal. So let me move to the gender and the feminism front here, and ask this question. So I often tell my students this, right, that patriarchy knows no racial or class bounds. Right, that's the one thing that seemingly, from a patriarchal standpoint, all the races seemingly kind of agree on that, unfortunately. So I think, right, we certainly see the influence of a patriarchal society on the characters who populate Salt of the Earth. So speak to the feminist leanings on display in the film. And do you think this perspective supersedes the social class discussion in the film? Or do you think that it works in tandem with it? Or is, of course, right, can both of them stand strong, side by side?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the remarkable achievement of this film, and this certainly is borne out by my recent watching of it, is that the way in which it interlaces the question of gender with the question of class. That is so powerful and so beautifully done. It's not easy to articulate an intersectional analysis in filmmaking. Like that is truly not it's not easy to articulate it in theory, right? And in our practice, or, you know, so I think, you know, one thing that was very striking for me was, you know, when by the end of the film, you know, with that famous sort of last set of lines where she's like, now, you know, we have dignity, right? That's what we've won, is dignity. To me, you know, that it takes on a different meaning after everything that has transpired, which essentially is a struggle for dignity, for women's dignity inside a struggle for labor dignity, and for racial dignity as well. Like, so for her to articulate that is really important. I think it also is really interesting that that the film presents this struggle for dignity and this patriarchal stance of the community as not in a very nuanced way. So if you recall the town meeting, when they're determining whether women can take the lead, right? There are men there that stand for them, right? Yes. The love story between Rosario Revueltas and Juan Chacon, like, that is one case in which you have a conflict. That's what makes that conflict so interesting, right? Because he is not with those men. But I think what's really critical in the film is that the film is portraying the fact that there is nuance inside of this patriarchal community, and that some men are able to see, right, without having to do the laundry, right, and experience what women experience. They're able to see, possibly because of their class critique, you know, or whatever reason, they're able to see that it is valid that women take the front role in this particular situation, because they're the ones who have the power. The men are being shut out because of legal maneuverings and all of this.
Do you all, Gary, you and Maria, do you all think that there's something to the fact that we see the white woman being a little bit more outspoken with her husband in some ways than we see the Latinos being with their husbands?
Do I see meaning in that?
Well, I'm just saying, do you? I mean, am I off base there by kind of pointing that out? Particularly,
to tell you the truth, that hadn't even crossed my mind. That's something that I didn't pick up on. But I agree that, you know, the gender issue supersedes the class issue in this movie. Maybe, I think in retrospect, looking at it now, I think that the gender issue is dealt with in a much more complex way than the class issue is dealt with. You know, the nuance that Maria was talking about in the patriarchy, that it talks about how, you know, not all the men, you know, believe that their women should stay at home. I think that was really, you know, until she said it, I hadn't really thought about it, but, you know, it's true. It's much more nuanced and much more sophisticated than the class argument. I think that hasn't really aged very well. But, you know, it speaks to other issues, I think, in the patriarchy and the Chicano movement that we get in the 1960s and 70s. That's what I was reminded of. A lot of these issues of like women participating and having their voice heard, you know, you could say that wasn't, you know, only occurring in terms of, you know, organized labor, but it was occurring throughout Mexican American culture, you know, and even within the Chicano movement, you know, if you've read any of those early Chicano works, you know that some of those works have very dated language. Everything is male in orientation, right? It's the Chicano movement, and it's not the Chicana movement. It's not until like the 80s when women really start to, 70s and 80s, when women start to assert themselves that then, you know, that gets called into question. So I think that's really, the gender issue is way more complex, I feel like, than the class.
Am I off base with that, Maria? You think about the way I talked to you about?
No, I mean, I do think it's actually it's suggested in the film, right? That the white woman, the wife of the organizer, is it's suggested by, I believe, one of the male protagonists, that she's coming around and riling the women up.
Yeah.
But what I think is interesting about that is it's clearly not true, because the first person to come and talk to the main female protagonist, now I can't remember her name, is a compañera, is a woman, you know, a loudmouth Mexicana who's like, you know, and her husband is warning her away from her. So, I mean, I think, you know, I think, you know, touching on something that Gary said, I feel like in the Chicano movement, Chicanas were very vocal really from the late 1960s forward, but they were often accused of being agringadas, or like listening to white women, right? Or and that feminism was you know, an import of, you know, white supremacist culture, and it was going to divide the movement and all this discourse, you know. And that is why I think that the film resonated so deeply with Chicanas in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was considered canonical for them, right? And so the film has this whole other history of being discovered by, you know, early adopters amongst Chicana feminists, and being a consciousness raising tool for them. So I think there's little question that, you know, when you ask like, well, what resonates more, the gender question or the class question, the way it gets taken up in the 60s is because of the gender question. I mean, that is what moves it, propels it forward.
So with that in mind, let me ask you all this question. What does the film gain by largely having Esperanza serve as the narrator? What does the film gain from that?
Gary, do you want to go first?
I think it allows for, you know, there to be a break with the idea that women, you know, can't get involved in the movement, right? That women should be quiet. It attacks that very directly by having her be, you know, the character that carries the narrative. You know, there's this whole idea of peace comes in the form of a woman, and you know, based on some of those representations, it doesn't, because, you know, the women are in there throwing punches, right?
Yes.
They're very willing to throw in punches. That scene of the when the woman is run over in the car, you know, and then that kind of like was, I think, really it was a shocking scene the way it was filmed, I think, for its time and day, you know, to see women just throwing punches and taking those guys out of the car and beating them up. I thought that was
And then the
really
chancla. I mean, she. Oh,
Yeah, the chancla. He got
oh.
the chancla treatment. That was amazing.
Man, that's awesome. Yeah. What do you think it gains by having her as the narrator?
Well, you know, I don't mean to be presentist or like somehow, yeah. I feel that when I had forgotten she was a narrator. I hadn't seen it in many years. And so when her voice first comes on, you know, what I thought of immediately was testimonio, you know. So I almost like was like in that genre, you know, that genre is very explicitly a kind of individual story that tells a collective history. Right. The testimonio genre is like, you know, this is, my name is Rigoberta Menchú and this is my story, right? And so for me, that moment when she speaks and that she carries it through with the narrative, to me, it was like that made the film seem like a testimonio, right? This is my story, but is the people's story.
Wow.
And, you know, we are one and the same. And and that's why the ending lines, you know, where she invokes dignity and all of this, it was like, it made it more powerful than had it not been narrated. And narration is strange in a I mean, you're a film scholar.
Yeah, people don't use it very much anymore. I mean, it's like pretty much film noir in the 40s and 50s, and outside of that, people, you know, and you know, Scorsese. Nobody really does. Yeah.
Right. And neorealism. I mean, in some ways, like the realist films, there's this Mexican film about a little boy. It's made around the same time. Now I can't remember. He loses his donkey. I don't know.
Oh, yes,
but,
yes.
You know what? So it's like a neoreal. I think, yeah, I can't remember. It was an American director who made it. But I think that given the neorealist kind of aesthetics, it gives it a feeling of, for some reason, it heightens the reality of it. And I can't explain it, but because narration doesn't seem like more realistic, but yeah.
Right. I mean, what you're saying about, I mean, the Italian neorealist style, right? This kind of, you know, and for those of you who are with us that don't know, the Italian neorealist style, which is born of movies like, which produces movies, I should say, like Roberto Rossellini's Rome Open City, and most famously Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves, where wanting to, you know, kind of counter this everything's cool, everything's fine kind of message the Italian government was sending post-World War II, was really kind of showing, you know, really wanted to make films that really kind of showed the working class and the poor, and kind of preferencing that, you know, that perspective, and using location shots, using non-trained and professional actors to kind of, you know, kind of heighten this level of authenticity, all of which this film does, all of which this movie does. So, you know, I think, like you said, that mixed with this kind of first person account, right? This testimony, right? Testimonial, if you will, really does kind of embolden, right, the message of the audience that we get from the film. And we really like it's almost like got an inside track, right, so to speak, on the film, and like how things happen, for sure, with it. Yeah, it's quite beautifully done. I really like the fact that she definitely kind of the way that she narrates this film. So, you know, so if in taking this to our current popular culture climate, you know, and this discussion now that's being had about who should be allowed to tell certain stories, right? Does this film, in you all's opinion, suffer by having a Jewish man, Herbert Biberman, tell this story of this largely Latino-centered group, Latino-Latina-centered group of union organizers and their families? Does it lose something? I mean, what would it be different if it had been a Latino or a Latina director, as opposed to this Jewish guy, Herbert Biberman, who I must say, right, class, I said class because I'm used to teaching, but who I might say was blacklisted. There's a documentary online, actually, you can see, called The Hollywood 10, which he's a part of, including people like Ring Lardner Jr., Dalton Trumbo, whatever, all these people who had, you know, refused to name names and were blacklisted. In fact, Biberman was thrown in jail, actually, and this is the first movie he makes when he gets out of jail. It's Salt of the Earth. So, so just to kind of give you some context about his struggle there, Yeah, you know, with that discussion, you know, does the movie suffer by having this Jewish man's perspective in telling this story?
I'll let Gary go first.
All right. I don't think so. I mean, that's my initial reaction. Of course, there's going to be differences with regards to, you know, the way a Latino approaches this versus somebody who's, you know, outside of the culture. But I think, you know, whenever I see Jewish people engage with Latinos or Hispanics or Mexican Americans in the struggle, you know, those struggles have been very connected, you know, amongst the Jewish and the Hispanic community. I just thinking about it, you know, it reminded me of like Alice McGrath and the Sleepy Lagoon trial, right? She was a Jewish American. She was fighting, she was helping these young boys trying to beat the rap that was, you know, that they had these accusations against them. So I don't think so, because, you know, the struggle there, you know, of both minority groups have often been in common. So I think that there's a lot that they can share in their experience.
Yeah, I mean, I was more surprised that a man was able to articulate the feminist critique through that narrative that he was able to do, that it wasn't made by a woman. Because to me, that film seems like it's made by a woman. I mean, I was, yeah. And I would say with along with Gary, you know, at least in LA, right, there was a lot of Jewish support, left Jewish support for even, you know, early Chicano movement activities. And for sure, you know, alliances. I was thinking about Alicia Escalante, who was a welfare mom who started the East LA Welfare Rights organization. For the first year of that organization, it was her Jewish doctor who basically got her office space and paid for her phone line, connected her phones, you know. And there's many stories of that kind of solidarity because of course, Jews and Mexicans were living cheek by jowl in many LA and Southern California neighborhoods because they were being systematically segregated. So there's, to me, like this story, I do think it's remarkable that a person who was not of Mexican ethnicity or heritage presented these people in a way that was not at all exoticizing or romanticizing. I do feel the portrayal was dignified, and the portrayal of women's struggle was dignified. In other words, and without romanticizing, right? Without making them like, you know, overly dignified or romanticized characters, like warts and all, but they had dignity. They struggled for dignity and they achieved it. And that's what I think makes it powerful.
Right, like you said, the little small things that happen in the story, like her, like Esperanza in the radio, for example, you know, just like you said.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, it's just, you know, and the pride that goes with that, and how, you know, Ramon is like, we can't even afford to pay for this, and this is all you care about. I wouldn't have to care about this radio if you cared about me, and you know, it's so all of these things like that, like you say, warts and all, but it's not. It's just this kind of human portrayal.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Layla was saying here that she loved the scene where Ramon and his colleagues finally come to recognize how essential the demand for plumbing is. That is a great scene. They're like, we do need water. This makes no sense. I'm like, oh, now y'all get it, you know. And the women are all like, I've been chopping wood all day, and the first thing he says is, what you've been doing all day, you know, which is hilarious. But yes, like a great many of the people in the cast were non-professional actors. And I look at the end, how they split it up and show you who the professionals were and who the non-professionals were. And to be honest with you, I mean, I think there's some of them that I could tell were non-professional, but some of them, like Ramon, I wouldn't have said was non-professional. I never would have said that. Yeah. I could have sworn that he was, you know. And then the sheriff is played by Grandpa Walton, so Will Gears, so pretty cool. I noticed that and all that. So I was like, look at this. Right? So this blend.
So Grandpa Walton was a lefty, probably.
Yeah, he was a lefty, right? Yeah, because there's no way, right, he'd have done this movie, right, had he not been. So that shows the Goya, as it says. For real. So here's a question I have for both of you as well. So I came across this question in my research about the film and wanted to pose this to you. So the producer Paul Jericho and the director, Herbert Bieberman, in an essay that was published in the California Quarterly, I think in 1960, refer to this film as, quote, a love story of two mature and decent people. Yeah. Do you agree with that assessment, and why not? And if you do agree, in what sense is the film a romance for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I mean, if I'm thinking about, if I want to, let me draw this metaphor out, because I'm a professor and that's what we do, of testimonio, right? The I embedded in the collective and the collective in the I. When I read that quote, I thought it was really interesting. And I was thinking about what it means. What is the significance of this love story where these two mature and dignified people are coming into a greater consciousness of each other's struggle? Right. So just as Ramon is understanding his wife's struggle of, housework, because he has to do it, she has taken his role and is understanding what it means to be put in jail, to be attacked by police, and to hold strong. Right. So it's like they're switching. It's like a Freaky Friday in northern New Mexico, except with a husband and wife. But anyway, and then I started thinking about so the love story is that they I guess they can't really love each other until they know each other's struggles in the fullness of those struggles. But then I was also thinking about how their love story is embedded in a larger story, right? And there's that moment, which is so profound when they're being evicted, right? Yes. Esperanza and her family are being evicted, and the entire community comes together, and as their beloved things are being taken out of the room, the women and the children and everyone are grabbing them up and taking them in the back door, right? Yeah. And to me, that moment signifies a solidarity of that community coming together, the love that they have for each other, more than really even the struggles that they're having on, the line and all of those moments of collective action. It's that moment in the domestic space where the community is coming together to prevent this horrible thing from happening or to undo it as it's happening. And so, for me, it's a love story of community and solidarity, as much as it's, thematized right through the love of these two individuals. It's also a kind of bigger story about how there can be no solidarity or collective enterprise without dignity and respect for all parties, right? Men and women, children, etc. So yeah, that's what I was thinking when I read that quote. It's this love story encased in a broader love story.
Oh, right. What about you, Gary?
I think, it's a complicated love story, to say the least, right? It's not a easy love story to watch sometimes. I think it makes you cringe at moments. I think the most romantic scene is the scene of Las Mañanitas, right? When he brings Esperanza, the community, they're all singing, right? And they have a few drinks, and they can't even really afford to pay for the drinks, but they all have a good time, and she remembers that for the rest of the week. Yeah. I think that was the moment. Okay, that's a nice scene. And but later on, I think some of the issues that she begins to have with him, he becomes the kind of gossip of some of the women that he's not supporting her, right? Yeah. It elicits a response from the other women, like, hey, your husband kind of sucks, right?
And they don't mind telling him that either,
right? But I think it's dignified. I think her long-suffering, woman thing that she does, it's dignified and expected maybe for the moment. But there was moments where I was like, I don't know if that would fly today, or like when he refuses to take the baby while she's on the picket line. It's like, wow, you're a jerk, Yeah. And so I found myself a lot of times saying that and thinking about that. Ramon is his name, right? Correct? That just kind of, I thought it was machismo. His machismo was a little old school and a little bit dated.
Yeah. I mean, but I tell you what, though, I love that scene, though, when she dresses him down in that bedroom. She says many rooms in this house, and you can pick anyone to sleep in, but not in here with me.
She sends her to the doghouse, right?
When he was like,
he raises his hand at her.
Yeah, he did. She said, and that's when we learn, right, that he's been hitting her before.
Right.
Because she says to him, oh, the old way. I see.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But she put her foot down that night.
She did.
But
I clapped a little bit. I did. I was at home like, get him, Esperanza, get him. Yeah, like,
it's also, I think what's so interesting to me is like, it's a story of social struggle and how social struggle always brings up contradictions, right?
mm-hmm.
And this is why, with the Chicanas in the movement, why it resonated so deeply, because even as they're men, we're out there fighting the man and, protecting their communities or whatever, they were oppressing women in the home.
Yeah.
And keeping women from taking those same roles. And, I think that those, many of those men grew in the movement because women articulated fierce and strong selves and in the movement, working alongside them as compañeras, so not all of them, some remained, unrepentant, sexist, but many of them grew. And the opportunity for growth is what I think is, to me, what signals the dignified representation of men and women in this film. It's like the opportunity to grow out of those old ways and into a new way of being. That is like, the true, I think, hope gesture in the film.
Yeah. A couple comments here. Shireen says she loves the connect. She loved that connect. She was talking that you were talking about. And also thought a touching scene was when Ramon tells Esperanza that it was their son Luis who reminded her of her Saints Day.
Uh-huh. I know, that made me very sad.
Luis was a good boy.
He was a good boy.
Luis was a good boy.
Yeah.
Was he the one that was born during all this? No, that's the old.
No, that's Juanito was born during this. Yeah.
And that's kind of chilling what she says at the beginning, right? When she says that she doesn't want to have a baby to bring.
Yeah.
That was like, wow, that's a pretty heavy way to start something.
Yeah.
But you know what it reminded me? It reminded me of kind of something that Toni Morrison touches on in Beloved, in Margaret Garner's real story, that the slave women that would rather have killed their children, right, than have them endure that pain. It very much so reminded me of that same sacrifice when she did that. And then immediately when she's giving birth, she's like, God forgive me, like I take it back.
Yeah.
But the fact that willingness, right, to say, I would rather sacrifice this child than bring him into this is mothering as well, right? That's very much so mothering.
That scene, though, like what really was so striking to me about that scene is that he's being beaten by the cops at the same time that she's giving birth. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah, they cross-cut those things, right? Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah, I don't know what to make of it. You're the film scholar, so you can tell me.
But I mean, that cross-cutting, and where it's this kind of, cutting back between two different things where it looks like a single scene. It is to juxtapose, right, like this notion, I think, of life, and then what life will be like when the child gets here. So it really does kind of reinforce what Mom was saying, Esperanza was saying at the very beginning, of why she didn't want the child to come. Is that and that cross-cutting reinforces that you bring them here and this is their lot in life, right, through no doing of their own.
Yeah.
That this is what, all in the name, right, of fairness. Fair wages. They're not asking for anything special here. They're asking for just like, what you would give to any decent person would give to a human being, and the struggle that goes along with that comes with that. And I think that scene really, that cross-cutting really does kind of reinforce that, for sure.
And it does connect the struggle of women with the struggle of men. They're different. Like it's saying, yes, they're different, but there is a connection here, and it's just a matter of these two finding what that is, and and working together to do something about it.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. Jennifer says, here's a question, says, we read that the lead actress was deported after the film came out, which is true, yes. She said, do we know if any of the other non-professional actors encountered backlash after being in this film? I read that there was some pushback in other ways, but not to the degree of what they did to her.
Right. Well, as a Mexican citizen, that is one way that they could, harm her. I thought it was during the making of the film, actually, in order to stop the film from being presented, but that may just be apocryphal. That's what I thought, but I don't know if that's true. But at this time, like I was talking about Francisca Flores, who was a huge fan of this film and a leader in the Chicana movement for many years. She went underground during this period. In the late 40s, early 50s, for like 3 years. She disappeared from FBI surveillance. So there was quite a lot of pressure on Mexican Americans, and I'm sure others, other communities who were left leaning or who were actual members of the Communist Party. So it was a hard time to make this film.
Yeah.
And, we also can't forget the experience of Dolores del Rio around the same time period, right? Her career.
What's the name again, Gary?
Dolores del Rio, the actress.
Dolores del Rio. Okay. Oh, yes.
Because, she experienced much the same thing where she was labeled as a radical, and her career in the United States was destroyed. And so she had to go to Mexico to finish off her career there. And that was really unfortunate that she kind of got wrapped up in that whole McCarthy era. I actually think it was Leo Carrillo who wrapped her up.
Ooh, gossip.
I don't know. I've always speculated. I've done a lot of work on Leo Carrillo, and I feel like he was pointing
people. That's another question. Like, how does knowing that many of these filmmakers were blacklisted and victims of McCarthyism, and so the people involved in the film, how does that affect the way we read or think about this film? To what degree is the film in a lot of ways? I mean, certainly it's dealing with its own issues in terms of, labor and feminism, amongst Mexican people. But to what degree, as a lot of films, did during this time, but kind of is metaphor. I'm thinking about like, what Arthur Miller does, for example, in The Crucible. How much of this is metaphor for also some of this kind of more communist, this punishment, right, by McCarthyism in this film?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious, or one perhaps obvious answer is it's the reason the film does not get wide release.
Yeah.
And, by the time folks start picking up on it, like, folks like Francisca in the late 1960s, it had been lost really to cinema. I mean, it was not a film that people knew about. And so really it's through the efforts of that generation of Chicano activists, particularly Chicanas, who, showed the film, reviewed it. Like they would show it at community centers, right? And schools and churches. And it's reviewed all across the radical feminist press at this time. Like, it exists because its reviews are popping up, by 1970 forward, in things like the Third World Women's Liberation newspaper. So it's being reviewed across kind of a print culture, across radical women of color print cultures. And so, I think its disappearance and resurgence because of activist intervention is that film history that it has is a direct result of the McCarthy era and the silencing of films like this.
Gary?
Definitely brave to make this movie back in the day. I think that was, it strikes me as being something completely odd that, Hollywood even let get in under its radar. It kind of boggles the mind that it was even produced and even they went through with it. But it seems like they were working in isolation too, which probably helped them, helped them to get the message out.
Yeah, northern New Mexico. I mean, also, just like it would be hard to keep track. I don't know. You'd have to be a pretty intrepid FBI surveillance dude to track them all to the way to northern New Mexico. I've been there now and recently, and it's not that easy to get around.
I think it's notable too that it came out like 1 or 2 years after the actual strike, right? So these people were like revved up and ready to go and ready to say something, right, to the outside world about what they had just experienced. And that's a brave thing to do.
Oh yeah, that's incredible. That, someone asked, well, they was surprised to hear that they were not professional actors. They were strikers.
Yeah.
And so one thing I was thinking about, like, what does it mean to represent an experience that you had in a social movement 2 years after, like following what Gary said, after you experienced it? I mean, that performance, it's just, it would be, I think like the closest corollary I can think of is like, a Black Lives Matter or Movement for Black Lives film starring Alicia Garza and like all of those folks who start like, you know, it's kind of it's inconceivable really to think like what kinds of what it takes to represent, you know, your struggle just a few years after on film.
Shireen asked, how was it financed? I think it was through through unions and things of that nature. Yeah, it's how it was financed. I mean, it was very much so. I mean, you want to talk about grassroots? There's a grassroots campaign to make this film. I mean, it was almost undercover. It had to be, right, because of the subject matter that they were dealing with. Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned a Black Lives Matter film. Something that stuck out to me, I was watching the movie again last night, and I just not too long ago have watched Judas and the Black Messiah.
Oh, right.
And immediately the tattletale, I say, it's always one. I say, every race of color, we got one that'll give us up. What did you all think about that character? I mean, because he like boldly, he didn't even try like to hide himself. He just sat there and picked them out and just told, and that's the leader, and that's his wife. And I was like, oh my God. You know, and he was already a scab to begin with. And the fact that he was used in that way to get that. I mean, do y'all have the same reaction when you watch it? Like, oh, come on.
I had the Judas and Black Messiah and, you know, thing in mind too. And also, you know, like surveillance, you know, in the 1960s also being such a, you know, a reality of every social movement with deadlier, I think, impacts for Black and Native lives, actually. But, you know, for sure, people were killed and infiltrated and imprisoned in the Chicano movement as well. And I'm sure, you know, earlier in labor movements.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, someone was surveilling Francisca Flores like everywhere. So it's like surveillance is like a fact of life of justice movements, you know, from the beginning, I would imagine.
And I think also in like just Latin American or Mexican American film, the notion of el vendido, right? Like the malinchista who somehow it's supposed to, you know, sell out the culture in a way. That I think is a really powerful one. They call him a rompehuelgas, I think is what they refer to him as. You know, and what struck me is that I think he was among the non-professional actors. Am I correct? The guy who sells them out, he was on the
he was a non-professional. He was. Yeah.
So for a minute I was like, was he the real guy that
the actual scab?
Of course not, you know, but in the blending of reality and fiction here, it kind of makes you question it.
This is interesting for real. So look, I see this movie's discussion of union organizing and even, you know, with feminism as well is just as significant as for example, as what Barbara Koppel does, right, in Harlem County, USA, which is a brilliant documentary. And certainly, right, this is a fictional account of what happens. But why do you think this movie has not received a reevaluation or resurgence over the years? I mean, I know it's not exactly obscure, but you know, it isn't, I mean, always part of the larger discussion that we have about socially conscious works of art in popular culture. And I mean, I know the reason it's the movie is in the public domain now because nobody bothered to you know, update the copyright in 1982. Wow. So in the public, so it's everywhere now. You go to, you know, I mean, and it's up there. But could you speak to that as to why you think this movie still? I mean, I just think this movie should be more widely seen, more on the tips of our tongues when we talk about movies that, you know, are kind of presenting this kind of social, particularly now in our concern, the way that we are so focused in our culture now on social justice and transformation of culture and things of that nature.
Do you want to go? Okay, so, you know, I think, first of all, I'll say that Harlem County, USA talks about white people, right? Okay, well, number one.
Yeah. Okay, well.
So, not to be too facetious, but I mean, I also think that as a document, it's been many, like, admittedly 20 years since I've seen Harlem County, USA, but you know, there's also a kind of film critic appreciation for auteur documentaries So I feel like the documentary as a kind of low budget, realist film genre is more appreciated than the sort of I think we could call it a neorealist, but I do think that Salt of the Earth is a little bit different in that it seems to be a mashup of a documentary and narrative film, right? So it's, as a genre, it's complicated and strange, right? Because again, as folks have noted, it uses non-actors, people who are actual participants. It has narration, but it's narrated by an actress. It's a narrative film, but it's representing, you could have made a documentary about the strike as it was happening, right? And so I think that because of its generic quirkiness, it's maybe hard to put in a box. Like if you teach film classes, right? So where would you put this one, right?
I mean, I would put it in the same discussion that we have with something like a Bicycle Thieves. We don't say that about Bicycle Thieves, right? We celebrate that, and that's heralded as one of the best movies ever made. And then here this movie is, which is still, right, this kind of undiscovered gem, which I really think is troubling. I mean, because it's working in the same spaces as a Bicycle Thieves or a Rome Open City.
Agreed. And I do think, I was only being slightly facetious. I should have said, like, listen, LA, okay, Los Angeles, I've been there, on occasion. And I will tell you, whatever, the people who are making culture in Los Angeles are used to seeing Mexican and Latinx folks and immigrants as domestic servants. And I honestly think that there is such a deeply embedded racial and class bias in the culture of Los Angeles, the film culture of Los Angeles, that it's going to take at least a couple of decades for there to be adequate representation of Mexican, American, and Latinx realities in that town. And it's certainly not going to happen if folks, the reason why we've seen gains in representation of Black stories and Black lives is because people have been out there hustling and breaking their backs inside the Hollywood system. And, they're struggling. But I feel like there's just such a strong bias in the film world against these stories. And as there have been against Black stories, as there have been against Asian stories, the story of, Minari and how it was snubbed, right? It's like, so that's why I think, that I think it's just deeply embedded white supremacist attitudes in the culture industry.
Okay. Gary, why don't we know this film better, Gary?
I think it's, how it presents the labor strike. I think it's a little dated. And I think that a lot of people that might turn off some people when they begin to watch it. I think we just don't have the language anymore. I mean, we don't, young kids today, don't know about unions, I mean, they've grown up in an environment where unions aren't a thing. And so you're kind of speaking this alien language to them about unions. And it's like a surreal world almost. Like, where does this exist? In New Mexico, in the mountains somewhere? I feel like because of our present situation, we've gutted unions, right? They're no longer an everyday thing in people's lives. But I think it's relevant to the moment. We're talking about $15 minimum wage. It's going through Congress, right? And issues about, paid leave. I think all of these, now that the pandemic has brought them to the fore, it's worth reevaluating. But yeah, I think you're always going to get a little bit of resistance just because kids don't know about union. I have family members who are in the IBEW, and I've seen firsthand how unions can, get you to another class, or at least secure your position within the middle class or the working class. Not a lot of people have that, especially when you're watching this movie perhaps from a right to work state like Oklahoma was, where I came from. So I think the language is not there for most young viewers.
But I mean, I also think, you're asking like an auteur question, right? You're also asking like, why in the film criticism world, or in the film,
or even just in the way that we think about film and talk about film. And you're right. I mean, they're in certain spaces. There are these movies that pop up all the time, right? And this doesn't pop up in the same way. You know, and you know, I'm thankful that it was shown to me. I'm aware of it, you know. But then I think about so many of my students. And this is something I think about with my students who are Mexican and Mexican American, my students who are Latino, you know, or Spanish, and they have no idea about Mexican filmmakers, and they have no idea. And I'm like, I'm saying, I'm teaching this to you, like, how are you not know, you know? And so I turned them on to these, you know, these Mexican filmmakers, and they come back to me, oh, Dr. Cunningham, what's some other movies I can watch? I say, I'm like, you know, and so I just wonder, you know, I worry about how, you know, these movies like this kind of fall. And again, I'm speaking from a film standpoint, but movies I think as important as this one, because I do believe this is a really important film. And for it to fall through the cracks like this, you know, and people are not seeing it, because again, if anything, if the labor part of it or the union part of it is dated, certainly the feminism part isn't.
Yeah.
That part certainly
like, you know, to me, like watching it again, it's like to me, there's a bigger story being told that I think would appeal to folks, even if they didn't know anything about unions, right? Because it's a story of power, right? And the complexities of power, and people who really just, they don't want riches, you know, they do want radios, but they want lives with dignity. And I think that is why, you know, that word dignity to me, like that is so profoundly impactful at the end. And I do think that is a universal message. I mean, that is like, you know, that is a message for Native Americans, for the Asian Americans, for, you know, African Americans, for working class whites, for women, you know, for trans folks. Like that message really does connect us. That everybody deserves to live lives with dignity. And that is definitely a message for today, for this moment.
We want bread and roses, right? That's the slogan of the WW. We want bread and roses. It's like Esperanza with her radio. She doesn't just want bread, she wants a radio, right?
She wants a radio, exactly,
Yeah.
And plumbing.
Right.
That would be like bread to me. That's
we ain't asking for a lot. Like you say, a radio and some plumbing.
Or water. You know, when I was just, you know, in Michigan with the Flint water crisis, right? And the idea that, like, you know, the denial of basic services, like what's happening in Mississippi, you know, it's like, folks, you know, I think this message of dignity, and that is the right of every single human being to expect and have, is a message that's as close to a universal message as we can get.
Is that the most important lesson in the film, you think, Maria?
To me it is. I mean, to me it is, because dignity can, it's, you know, it can mean different things for different people. There are different stakes in this. And so, yeah, I mean, to me, that is the overarching message. So to me, it's less of a labor film than a film about, you know, how communities in struggle come to, you know, understand themselves of people deserving basic human, you know, dignity, when they had accepted, both the women had accepted certain bad treatment from the men, the laborers had accepted to a certain extent bad treatment from the bosses. And the struggle for dignity becomes, to me, the central animating struggle that links these two things.
What about you, Gary? What's the most important lesson from the film?
I think Maria summed it up pretty well. I think it's hard to follow that. I'm going to second what she said. And I think it's very, very well put.
Cool. All right. Layla says here that what we were just talking about reminds her of Esperanza's beautiful lines when she explained that the house is not theirs, but the flowers are.
Yeah.
Esperanza has some really beautiful lines. She really did. She did. Well, wow, this has been great. So that's all the questions I have for you all. Let's see, does our audience members have any questions they'd like to ask Gary and Maria about the film?
You've done such a good job. There's nothing left to ask.
Thank you. Mom, what do you have to ask? Mom, I know you got something to ask.
Yeah, Mom, when was the first time you saw Salt of the Earth, and what did you think?
I guess the first time was 1966,
Wow.
when we were organizing the Great Boycott here in Austin, Texas.
Mhm.
And so, and I think I have a copy somewhere. Everybody has a copy somewhere. I know I have a copy. And my only, well, I have a lot of observations. I love that quote. You know, I love that quote. You know, the house may not be ours, but the flowers are. And I wanted to encourage Maria about LA. Okay, that's exactly what it's all about. We may not have what we wish we would have, but we have what is very important to us, and that is, you know, nuestra cultura, nuestro arte, um, whatever we want to do with the education of our children. And you know what? We can wait. And if LA sees us as landscapers and domestics, that's fine. Because here in Austin, landscapers and domestics got ourselves a beautiful cultural center. We have a beautiful Mexican museum. We have La Peña, and we work every day to nurture the flowers. You know, and I think you know, a home or a house, a building is just a building, but I think that that we have what it takes in terms of dignity. You know, in terms of staying power, because you know, having what nurtures your soul and spirit, I think is what keeps you alive and creative and blooming. But I also want to say that we used salt of the earth. And as you all were commenting, Gary, Mark, Maria, about the use of the film as consciousness raising, it was very, saddened me very much because of the white women's movement, mainstream movement went way off kilter. And only the very fortunate that were sleeping with the fortunate, you know, got anywhere. I mean, it's been grassroots women climbing up that steep hill for over 35 years. That's made the movement come alive. But I think that had these white women had the intellect and the ganas,
Don't tell the truth,
show
bro.
films like this in their meetings, the way we showed films like this in our meetings,
Mm-hmm.
you know, where we could look at class issues as well as gender issues and other economic issues, of course. I think it would have been a different movement. And I'm very happy to say that I don't remember a single decent civil rights and Chicana feminist conference that didn't show this film.
Right.
Wow.
My case.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
Right. So I think that's a really important point, because yes, it has disappeared. I agree, you know, from our like film history consciousness, but it is canonical for the history of Chicana feminism. And it, you know, was central to organizing and consciousness raising. And like I said, it's in every newspaper, reviews of it are everywhere. She's right. I've seen many conference programs. There's always a showing of salt of the earth. So yes, it is. For us, it's part in, you know, really ingrained in our Chicana feminist memory.
This has been wonderful. I have enjoyed this so much. Is there anybody else have any questions? Mom, you shut it down.
No.
Drop the mic. Mic drop.
Oh man.
Definitely.
Sharena, I'll turn it back over to you then.
Well, it's hard to follow, Martha.
Yes.
But thank you so much, all of you. This was, I'm glad we've recorded it, because many people who missed it, I think once they watch the film, they want to know more. And this is the absolute perfect kind of conversation to have. I feel like I learned a lot. Film is still relevant. Sadly, all the themes are still relevant. And it makes me think about, you know, a lot of what was going on in the film makes me think about how in peace, the discipline of peace studies, we define peace. There is negative peace, which we want still, which means the absence of active violence, direct violence. And then there's positive peace that is required in order to sustain peace. And that's basically like social justice. So if the white mine workers have plumbing and have hot water coming to the kitchen, and the Mexican Americans don't have it, then that community does not have positive peace. And that was one of the things that the film brought up. They kept talking about like, they have it, but we don't. So that the community was out of balance, and something needed to happen. There was conflict that had to happen to transform that community and build something better. And we talk about in conflict transformation, these kinds of things don't happen really quickly. So you don't get to have a meeting with the big boss and say, well, we demand, it's not fair. And they say, okay. So it needs to be kind of an iteration, so it's a fantastic film and a really great thing that you brought to us, and the discussion was perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Gary and Maria, look, all these notes I have here from everything you said. So I'm going to be busy this weekend looking up all of these stuff. I hope I spell these names right. So.
Well, Mark, I want to have a weekly film chat with you.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. I love it. I would love that.
I thought of that Toni Morrison thing too. I mean, we're thinking alike here.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Good deal. I loved it.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Maria. It was great to be here and do this with you guys. Martha, your words were awesome as well. So thanks to everybody, the whole team cheering as well. You guys
I'm so lucky to be in your presence, Mom. I love it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much.